What a gorgeous morning. Thank y'all for giving up a little bit of the prettiest morning so far this spring to come and talk about veggies. I always have to ask, how many people are here for the first time? Wow. How many people are your first seminar as well? A lot of folks do? Okay. One more question. How many of y'all have a garden now? Okay, so a few of y'all just interested in getting started. How many people picked something out of their garden either this morning or last night? Very good. The rest of you, if you come again next year, I want to see everybody's hand go up. I mean, I left at 3:15 this morning. I did not pick anything out of my garden this morning, but yesterday I picked spinach and mustard for some of the folks around here. The day before I gave a friend that came over some heads of broccoli. One of our other employees brought in a bunch of radishes a little bit earlier this week. If you grow a good garden, there should be something you can pick out of your garden every single day of the year. And if you enjoy fresh, veggies and leafy vegetables and root vegetables, and for some of us, I mean, a garden is a tomato patch, basically. But there's a whole lot of other material that you can certainly grow. And I think we're probably warm enough. Let me turn this off so nobody gets burned. Sit on a stair or crowd in. It's a chilly morning. Everybody can sit close together. But anyway, my intent... Oh, I see some spaces kind of up and to the right if you want to go crawl over a few folks. What I want to do this morning is talk a little bit about the basics of gardening, things that you need to know regardless of what you're going to grow. And then we'll talk about some hints on specific different crops and things. I promise over the years that I've grown a garden, I've made probably every mistake that could possibly be made. And for those of y'all that are new here, we do have a few ground rules. Number one, there's no such thing as a dumb question. If you have a question you think is a dumb question, probably half the people in here would like an answer to it. So ask, and don't hesitate to stop me if I'm unclear on anything. If it's something I'm going to cover in a few minutes, I'll put you off for a few minutes. If it's something that's appropriate, I'll stop and answer it right then. I think there are a few more spots up here.
Thank you. Sorry we're late. We got caught up in the traffic.
You understand that. There's no such thing as late. You just weren't quite as early as everybody else. Come on in, there are places around. The other thing is that there's this little game that we play. If you have something going on that you don't want to admit is happening in your own yard or your own garden, you simply stick up your hand and say, my neighbor couldn't come this morning, but he or she wanted me to ask you this. So we'll know what's going on, but if it makes you feel any better, feel free to do so. But what are the good things you need to grow a really good garden? Number one, you need lots of sunlight. That is simply the most important thing. There is no substitute for sunlight. If you don't have enough sunlight, move. If you can't move, get a chainsaw and cut down those trees or whatever is keeping the sunlight from hitting the area. But in all truth, it does take good sun to grow most of the things that we want to eat. Now, you don't necessarily even have to have a garden per se. There are a lot of these things that can be mixed into flower beds. Many herbs are absolutely wonderful ornamental plants as well. Basil makes one of the prettiest green annuals that you could ever imagine. And there's nothing wrong with mixing, peppers. How many people have chili pequins growing in their landscape intentionally or otherwise? You can mix other things in. And even if you don't have a lot of space in the ground, Donna, come on in, wonderful person who puts a lot of things together, put together some pots sort of like this. And while this pot is pretty, it also has several lettuces mixed in here that you could harvest from over a substantial period of time. Pansies are edible as flowers, as are calendulas. There are lots of different things you can do. You can garden in containers. If your dog chews up everything that's down at ground level, grow a garden in hanging baskets. Granted, you're not going to pick 500 pounds of tomatoes like I plan to, but you'd be amazed how many things you can grow in hanging baskets or in containers of one sort or another. But whatever you're growing needs to have good sunlight. You need to have reasonable soil. Now, very few people in this area start out with good soil. I mean, here our soil is either non-existent or lousy. But you can take soil and turn it into better soil, mainly through the addition of organic material and also through the addition of literally life. The life we put into the soil, the microbes we put into the soil in terms of beneficial bacteria and fungi. The things that build organic material more than anything else are things that you can't see. The greatest amount of what we call biomass, organic material in the soil, is built by bacteria. Bacteria individually are tiny, but they reproduce at the rate of about a new generation every 17 minutes or something like that. So just by encouraging the microbial activity in the soil, you're going to get your soil better and better and better, and consequently your garden is going to get better and better and better over the years. Are insects a problem? There may be a few here and there, but the better the soil is, the better your organic techniques are, the fewer insects that you will see in the garden, and the ones that you will see are usually fairly easily controlled. The same thing is true for most diseases. Truly, in an organic garden, I mean, I grew up in the chemical world. I started out chemical gardening, but I can promise you, in an organic garden, you spray about 1/10 as much as you ever did before, and if you prepare the soil properly, it's just you're not going to have many problems that are difficult to solve. So you need good light, you need good soil, you need to plant at the right season. That is one of the most common mistakes that people make, is planting things at the wrong time of year. And like I say, there should be something you can harvest from your garden every single day of the year. But we have things that grow in cool weather, we have things that grow in warm weather, we have things that grow in hot weather. You don't want to plant your hot weather crops too early. Some of the hot weather crops include things like okra and eggplant, and even peppers to some extent. Those are things that we won't be planting again probably for at least 6 or maybe even 8 weeks. We have warm season plants that we will plant as soon as we're past the danger of a hard freeze. And don't ask me when the last freeze is going to be. Years ago, when I first moved to this area, I worked with an incredible gentleman up in the hill country, Alton Grimm. Some of y'all that have been around a lot of years, might have the pleasure of knowing Alton. He came by and we visited. He's the guy I gave the broccoli to 2 days ago. Alton is a real inspiration to all of us. I mean, the man was given 6 months to live with cancer 31 years ago, I think. So anyway, it's proof of the power of a positive attitude and a good outlook and all. But I used to, when I worked with Alton, people would come in and say, "Mr. Grimm, when it's going to freeze?" And I'd look him in the eye and it'd say, "When it gets to 32 degrees. So when is the last freeze we're going to have? The last day it gets to 32. That's the last day we're going to have a freeze. Cool weather plants, we plant both in the fall and in the spring. Some of them that grow and produce quickly, we can still be planting cool weather plants right now. Some of them that take a longer period of time to produce, we have to plant those in the fall. So, I want to talk a little bit about soil preparation and things like that, and then we're going to go through pretty much crop by crop in whatever order you guys want to, and talk about some of the secrets to being very successful with all the different things that you grow in this area. So, we're going to have good light, we're going to have good soil, we're going to plant at the right season with the right varieties. Of course, that's not nearly as much of an issue because you can always find somebody to advise you on good varieties. But once you've decided that this particular plot of ground is going to be where you grow your garden, what are we going to do to improve the soil? I think there's some spots, if you don't mind crawling over some spots around here. Again, everybody stays a little bit warmer. The bigger the crowd gets, the closer we sit together, and the warmer it gets. Ma'am? Okay, the things that you need in your garden to grow a good garden are organic material and good nutrients. There's some things that we add something a little extra to, like in the case of tomatoes, we add Epsom salts because it stops blossom end rot, but we'll talk about that when we talk about tomatoes. But basically the 2 things you need are plenty of organic material and plenty of good fertilizer. Now, as your garden gets better year after year after year, you can pretty much stop adding organic material or add just a little bit of organic material. The problem with organic material in the soil is so much of it has been burned out by chemical fertilizers. Years ago, we'll use the Rio Grande Valley for an example. Years ago, most of the soils in the Rio Grande Valley had about 6% organic material in it. Everybody knows we grew the best citrus in the world, we grew wonderful spinach, we grew just all kinds of incredible crops. Well, 50, 60 years of chemical gardening, now the organic content of the Rio Grande Valley soils is less than 1/2% in most areas. And consequently, the crops are not nearly the quality they used to be. The minerals in the crops aren't nearly the quality they used to be. I read a USDA report that said spinach harvested today has about 5% as much iron as it did in the 20s and 30s. It's all the way we've screwed up the land with chemical fertilizers. And the things that chemical fertilizers do, besides killing microbial life in the soil, the reason that they burn the organic material out of the soil is that the microbes in the soil, the bacteria and the fungi, especially the bacteria, have to have an energy source to survive. And if you don't have microbes in the soil, you can't grow anything, because microbes are what convert all the different minerals and fertilizers, chemical or otherwise, into a form that plants can absorb and use. Somebody couldn't find a parking place. Anyway, the source of energy for the soil microbes that do so much for us is organic material in the soil. Virtually all the energy in the world, other than nuclear, is tied up in the form of carbon bonds. In energy, I mean the coal, the oil, the gas that you burned in your cars to get here this morning, all that material was once plants. Those plants got their energy from the sun and took the sun's energy, converted it into what we call chemical energy in the form of something called carbon bonds, and things in the soil, the microbes and various other things, break these carbon bonds to get the energy that they need to live. When you put a chemical fertilizer on the ground, there's no energy in there whatsoever. There's no organic material in there. So the microbes in the soil break down the organic material that's already there. And over the years, the level of the organic material just goes down, 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 down. When you put an organic fertilizer on the soil, the organic material not only, or the fertilizer not only takes all of the organic material that it needs in with it, it builds more organic material. Every time that you fertilize with an organic fertilizer, you increase the organic content of the soil. Every time you feed with chemical fertilizer, you decrease the organic content of the soil. So, when you first start out, you probably are going to need to add more organic material to your soil. What are the two best ways to do this? Well, instant organic material is compost, and that bag right there, I think, is the best compost you will ever find in a bag. It's by Ladybug. They call it Revitalizer compost. If you're going to buy compost in bulk, I think New Earth has by far the best compost in the area. Fertile Garden Supply would be second, but they don't ever want me to mention this, but they buy a lot of their compost from New Earth and blend it with their own. I'm not real hot on Gardenville compost since Malcolm doesn't run the show out there anymore. It's just not the quality it used to be. But if you're looking for it by the truckload, I'll send you to New Earth or to Fertile Garden Supply or to one of the many people that carry New Earth products. I buy it from Stone and Soil Depot. They happen to be out near where I am, but there are about 15, 20 different people that carry the New Earth products. But anyway, if you're starting out with lousy soil, bringing in some compost is going to be one of the best things you can do. Making your own compost, I still recommend very, very highly. The problem is, I don't know anybody who can make enough compost to do the amount of gardening that most of us enjoy. And by the way, if you're thinking about compost, do it in a pile, whether it's in a container or out of a container. You see these little gimmicky things they call barrel composters, and they say, oh, you know, you can make compost every 2 weeks, and you're supposed to stand out there and turn it 100 times a day or whatever. It's good exercise. You won't have to join a health club if you do this. But you don't get the good quality compost that you do in a compost pile. Just 90-second digression here. Two things break down organic material. Two things make compost: bacteria and fungi. Fungi being plural of fungus, of course. Some people have never learned that, including Malcolm Beck, who talks about funguses. No, fungi. Bacteria are very tiny, and you can put those in a composter, and you can spin them around and you know, turn them over with a pitchfork 10 times a day, whatever you want, and you don't really harm them. But one of the most important things we have in the compost pile, one of the most important things you have in your soil, are beneficial fungi. And the fungi are the things that decompose the woodier material, the chunks of tree bark or limbs or whatever else, really heavy things. It's one form or another of fungus that breaks those down. Now everybody's gone out and maybe you're turning over a pile of leaves, maybe you have a compost pile, maybe you're just digging in the ground and you see all this white thready material running all through the place. That's good stuff. That's fungus. That's beneficial fungus, and it's doing a lot of good things in the pile of leaves or in the compost bin or whatever else. But instead of being tiny, almost microscopic in size, you know, these things are big, long pieces of material. Well, what happens every time you turn that barrel, every time you go out with that compost fork and you turn your compost pile over, you're breaking that stuff up and you're killing it and you're limiting its ability to do what it needs to. So in a compost pile, I don't recommend turning it more than 2-3 times a year. You get better compost that way. And simply because of the fungal action. I want to tell you just what to do. I want to tell you why you do it, because you'll remember it a whole lot longer. You remember it till tomorrow instead of just till the seminar's over. But anyway, that's why I think that static pile composting gives you by far the best compost. How much compost do you need? There's no such thing as too much compost. You should be limited by your bank account, by the ability of, you know, your time to create that garden. I think probably the prettiest squash plant I have ever seen. Several years ago I had the pleasure of going to Switzerland. In one place wandering through the countryside, there was an old barn. They put their barns way up high, and there was a pile of manure and compost that had just been shoveled out of the end of the barn for who knows how many years. And growing out of the top of this compost pile was truly the prettiest squash 2 or 3 plants that I've ever seen in my life. Good compost, you could grow in pure compost if you wanted to, but you don't really need to. I'll tell you a little bit specifically about how I get ready to plant in just a minute. But anyway, compost is one thing that you can add to the soil to improve it. The other thing you do is add things that stimulate bacterial life. What stimulates bacterial life? Sugars, carbohydrates. This is what really, you know, makes those bacteria reproduce and do all the things that they do. Probably the most effective form, at least as far as cost and as far as what works well, the most effective form of sugar is molasses, because it's cheap. You can eat it as you go if you like. Actually, I'd have feeders out for my cattle, and I have a guy that comes around with a big truck and refills them every couple of months. And that stuff's really cheap. I mean, I think I'm paying him $2 or $3 a gallon, which is a lot less than we can buy it for here at the nursery. But generally speaking, molasses is going to be one of your best sources of sugars. But don't throw away anything sugary. If you've got old Coca-Cola or whatever else in there that you know, sugared, that stuff's fine to dump on your compost pile. Again, Malcolm Beck, one of my several good mentors and the man who started and ran Gardenville for many, many years and who made a ton of compost, Malcolm was when he was with Gardenville, still is, one of the great innovators of reusing things. He found out that the Coca-Cola bottling plant here was paying Saws thousands of dollars a year for the right to pour their old out-of-date Coca-Cola down the sewer system. Well, Malcolm said, I tell you what, if you'll bring it out here, I'll let you spray it on my compost piles at no charge. In fact, I'll even pay you $5 a load for it. So, of course, they jumped on that and thought that was a great thing. His compost piles started working faster and faster and getting hotter and hotter. How hot did his compost piles get? I've seen it. One Thanksgiving, he took a turkey, wrapped it up, you know, in the baking paper, wrapped it up in 2 or 3 layers of foil, buried it in his compost pile for 36 hours, and he claims it was the most succulent moisture. Since that time, I know he's cooked at least 1 pig and a few other things, and that's how hot it gets. So you get a compost pile so hot it catches on fire. That's not going to happen in your backyard, but anyway, that's what anything sugary like that is really going to increase the breakdown in your compost pile because it stimulates that bacterial activity. And anything that is sugary, well, not anything, but just about anything that you have that's sugary would be a good thing to dump into the compost pile. There's one antimicrobial sugary substance. Anybody know what it is? Honey. Don't put honey in there. Honey doesn't really do much. Have you ever noticed honey doesn't ever grow any mold on it? Honey's antimicrobial. They're finding wonderful things to do with honey. They're using it in serious burn cases. Anyway, that's off the subject. But anything sugary in there, whether it's old chocolate cake or old Coke syrup or molasses, that's the sort of thing that's really going to make your compost pile work faster. And in your soil, you can put on liquid molasses, dilute it down to a couple ounces per gallon. You can put on dry molasses. Dry molasses is molasses that has been taken and soaked into a solid material, a substrate, so to speak. Dry molasses is not crystallized molasses. It's not molasses with the moisture taken out of it. The best dry molasses out there is by a company called Nature's Guide, the best that I've found. They actually take soybean meal and soak the molasses into it. But remember, it doesn't dissolve. It's in solid form. Everybody should know this, especially somebody that sells sprayers. The man that sold me the sprayer that I pull behind my tractor should know better. He decided he was going to spray his field with molasses, so he went and got some bags of dry molasses and dumped them in the tank. Took him 3 days to clean his sprayer out. It clogged it up so badly. So if you're going to spray, use liquid. If you're going to put it on dry, use dry molasses, but they are not interchangeable. But both of them are wonderful things to use to improve the quality of your soil. But the way they do it is by increasing microbial activity. Don't overdo it. If you put it on too strong, you can actually kill things. It creates so much biological activity. Anybody ever fight nutgrass? Do you ever have a problem with nutgrass? You don't have to use any kind of poisons to get rid of nutgrass. You can kill it with molasses. Mix your molasses, about half a cup of molasses to a gallon of water. And you have to do this when it's dry. When it's real wet, nothing kills nutgrass. But in a dry season, go ahead and just pour that on your nutgrass. Do it again in about 3 or 4 weeks, and a month later, your nutgrass will be dead and gone. You can use too much molasses, but in the garden, it'd be difficult. Anyway, I digress. You got to get organic material into the garden, and then you need to use a good fertilizer in your garden. I like dry fertilizers, granular fertilizers. Really, the only reason is because they last and they continue to work for a longer period of time than the liquids. Liquids are great, but you're going to be putting your liquids out every couple of weeks. You can put the dry on and it'll be there for 6 or 8 weeks, and then you can just put it on a whole lot less often. Take your choice, but I like using dry fertilizers to start with. And I like using organic fertilizers. Now, I just told you some of the bad things that chemical fertilizers do in soil. Another problem we have with chemical fertilizers, and those of y'all that have come the past couple of weeks, I realize this is repeating the same thing. But everybody remembers your basic biology or chemistry or physics or whatever, that like charges repel. Positive repels positive. Negative repels negative. If you switch them around, like charges attract. Positive, negative bind together. You've taken those magnets, at least I did as a kid, you turn them the wrong way and you see if you can force them together and you're not strong enough to do it, you turn them around the other way and they just lock together. Well, why is that important? Our soils are full of clay particles, which for the most part carry a negative charge with them. When you put on a chemical fertilizer, you're putting on nitrates, nitrites, phosphates, sulfates. You're putting on little particles that have a negative charge. When you put a negative charge chemical product on a negatively charged soil, what happens? They repel each other, and most of it washes away. When you put out chemical fertilizers, probably 90% of it or more washes away. Now, number one, that's not doing your plants much good, but even worse, you're causing horrible pollution problems. If you listen to Bruce Dooley on Saturday afternoons on KTSA, you'll hear him talk about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know how big it is this year, but I know last year it covered hundreds and hundreds of square miles, bigger than 2 or 3 of the New England states. Why is there a dead zone? Why is there an area that there are no fish, no oysters, no clams, no crabs or anything else? Because of all the fertilizer that's washing down the Mississippi River. They have now found that there are dead zones. Every major river where it empties into the ocean will have a dead zone out there just from the chemical fertilizers that wash down the river. Not necessarily the chemical fertilizers that are killing, but they're causing weird things to happen with algae that end up killing everything in the water. That's one of the other problems with chemical fertilizers. Organic fertilizers, now they have their components in a positively charged form. We call it a cation. usually in the form of what we call ammoniacal compounds. So you put your fertilizer out and it binds to the soil. Okay, number one, the plants are going to get the benefit of probably 95 to 98% of that fertilizer material. Virtually none of it washes away. The plant, when it's ready for that chemical or from that natural fertilizer, can actually break it free from the soil. It releases a stronger positive charge, grabs the nutrient particle, and that's why organic products are so much more efficient in how they feed your plants. They stay in the soil longer, they don't wash away, they don't cause pollution problems. Had a big fight with developers when they were going to do the PGA Village, trying to get them to go organic. They said, oh, we can't use organic fertilizers, we'd pollute the aquifer. I'm saying, you're calling yourself an engineer and you don't even know the basics of soil chemistry. Anyway, organics are the way to go in your garden. Organics just don't burn. The only disadvantage to organics is some organic products and some good fertilizers. The company makes Maestro Grow products, which I think are wonderful fertilizers, but don't use them if you have a dog, because they use a lot of alfalfa in making their fertilizers. And puppy dogs are smart creatures. They know alfalfa tastes good and it's good for you. And they will happily eat all the fertilizers you put on your plants. You mix cayenne pepper with it, by the way, if you want to avoid that problem. But anyway, organic products are what I would use in the garden. Yes, sir?
I had a question about the solids. We started using the solids and we had feral hogs, and they found it, apparently it was edible, so they ate about half of it. We got the big bag. So we put it in a plastic bucket with a lid to solve that problem. We sprinkle it on the plants. Do we need to mix it in the soil?
No. With organic fertilizers, you can put them right on the surface. Now, like everything else, to be used by the plants, they're going to be digested by microbes in the soil. If you want to make them work faster, put your fertilizer down and then put a thin layer of compost on top of it. That way you'll get them into a usable form a whole lot faster. But there's no reason that you have to work with the soil at all. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question about compost. You rated the other composts, and you mentioned ladybug and new earth. Can you give me an estimation of the ABC who will come out and spray the compost? What kind of compost might I be getting?
Well, I wouldn't put it on your vegetable garden. And this is just a personal thing, I do not like biosolids compost. Biosolids, we call them biosolids because nobody wants to call them sewage sludge anymore, which is what biosolids compost is. The nice name they apply to it here is Alamo Grow. And when you buy Gardenville some of their fertilizers, and when you buy their Alamo Grow compost, that's what you're getting. And that's the one thing that I don't like about ABC, is that's the compost they use, because it's the only one that they've really found will go through that big blower real well. I'm trying to get them to work more with New Earth and trying to get New Earth to screen their material where it will go through their sprayer. I think it's fine on the yard, but I wouldn't use it in my vegetable garden. Other question? Yes, sir?
Just real quick about compost piles. What do you put your kitchen scraps and things like? The reason I asked, I have a compost pile, but when turning it, you get those great big huge slugs.
Slugs or grub worms?
Grub worms, sorry.
Okay. Those are not bad. Those are the grubs. Every kind of beetle out there has a grub as an intermediate stage of its life, and those are not the grubs that eat your lawn. Now, around here, if you look like you have a sense of humor, you may be in trouble because you're going to get teased. And when somebody comes in and they look like they have a sense of humor and they have those giant grubs, I'll look at them and say, oh my God, is this dome dirt? Or, do you live on toxic waste stuff? No, the truth is that's a whole different species of beetle. It's not going to cause any problem whatsoever in your garden. It's something that eats compost, not plant roots. Yes, ma'am?
Is it okay to use oak leaves? Someone told me don't use oak leaves because they might have a fungus or something.
No. You can go back and inform your friend. Anything that was once alive. She learned very quickly. If it was once alive, it can be used to make compost. Oak leaves are slow to break down, and they take longer to decompose, but there's no fungus or anything like that in there. Virtually everything in the world, anything toxic in this world, with only one exception that I know of, will be digested either by microbes or destroyed by heat. A compost pile may easily get up to 180 degrees. So you're going to break any pathogenic material down that's in there. Everybody says, can I throw dog poop in the compost pile? Sure, if you want to. But it's going to be decomposed and broken down to where there's nothing harmful left in it. But the harder and tougher the material is, the bigger it is, the faster it's going to, or the longer it's going to take to break down. Oak leaves are very tough, and they don't break down nearly as quickly as ash leaves. Big chunks of wood don't break down nearly as quickly as little pieces of sawdust. So anything that you can do to chop it up, run your mower through those leaves 2 or 3 times, throw them in there, they'll break down a lot faster. The ideal compost pile will be a mixture of what we call brown materials, carbonaceous materials like leaves and things like that, and green materials, or materials that contain more nitrogen. That would include your kitchen scraps, that would include some animal waste, that would include when you grind up the little bitty small limbs on the tree, you're getting a lot of what we call the cambium in there, you're getting a lot of protein, which has a lot of nitrogen in it, and it's very different from the big old woody center of the tree. So ideally, carbon and nitrogen ratio of 8 to 1, 10 to 1, 12 to 1, depends on who you ask, and that's what will make compost break down fastest and give you the quickest usable compost. Now if you take nothing but sawdust and make a pile of it 10 feet deep, it's eventually going to break down. But if you mix it in with some material that has more nitrogen in it, it will break down a lot faster. And if you want to make those oak leaves break down a lot faster, spray a little molasses on them. That stimulates the things that make them decompose. But you're never going to get diseases out of a compost pile that you would have to worry about. Everybody's so worried about oak wilt these days. No, never going to be in a compost pile. Yes, ma'am?
You're talking about just layering it because you said not to turn it. So it's okay to layer green?
Either that or mix it up as you put it in. Yeah. I layer it in that I throw in one thing one day and throw in the next thing the next day, but I don't, it's not a scientific thing and it's not an exact thing. Just kind of let it mix up a little bit as you go and it'll work out fine. The way that I do, if you went to my garden, I've got 2 compost piles made just out of fence wire about this big around. And I'll fill this one until it's full, and then I'll go over and start filling this one. By the time I get this one full, this one's ready to use. By the time so I empty it out and put it there and start filling it. By the time I get it full, this one's ready. And just alternate back and forth. I think a 2-pile system works well. Yes, ma'am?
Pepper Joe sent me. But, and so he said, anyway.
Okay.
I talked to him this morning.
Kim, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
And 2 questions. When do you know the compost is ready? And is there anything you should not use? I mean, you're saying basically.
Okay, both good questions. The compost pile is ready when it stops producing a lot of heat. The way Malcolm always said when he made compost, he would stick his hand all the way into the pile and pull it back out, sniff. If it was stinky, it wasn't ready. If it smelled just like, good old earthy soil, it was ready. But the main thing you'll notice is that it stopped producing heat. Things you should not put in it. Meat scraps can be a problem if you have raccoons and possums and things like that get into it. But you can always dig a hole and bury those in the ground. And they will do good things in the ground. And herbicides should stay out of the compost pile. The worst herbicide in the world, the only thing that is known that microbes will not break down, is this stuff that people sometimes spray on their hay. It's called picloram, and it's sold under names like P plus D or Grazon or things like that. It basically kills everything except grass, and it doesn't go away. Stay away from that stuff. It's nasty. It'll ruin your soil, it'll ruin your garden, it'll kill your plants. It sees everything in the world except grass as a weed and tries to kill it. But other than that, no. Eggshells, citrus peels, whatever else, all that can go in the thing.
That's what I was going to ask, orange peels.
Yeah. I don't know where this rumor came from that orange peels were bad for the compost. Nothing at all wrong with them. In fact, Howard Garrett was doing some work in Central America, and it's just kind of the typical thing. On one side of the hill, there's a big aloe plantation where they're growing aloe vera, and they're having a problem with root knot nematodes. On the other side of the hill is a huge orange grove that's doing orange juice concentrate, and they don't know what to do with all the peels that they've got when they juice the oranges. Well, they ship them to the other side of the deal, work them into the soil, and for some reason an orange peel kills nematodes, so they get rid of their orange peels now, and the aloe grower doesn't have any more nematode problems and has better soil. No, nothing wrong with orange peel in it. Anything else before we move along? Yes?
What's the difference between compost and compost tea?
That is a good question, and be sure and come back next week when we talk about if you took compost, you've got a good solid material. That's what that bag's full of. If you put a bunch of compost in a bucket and filled it with water, let it sit for a little while, and you poured the water off of that, you would have what we call compost leachate. It's full of all the microbes and things that were in the compost. If you took that compost leachate and you dumped in a bunch of stuff to make those bacteria and fungi reproduce, have a real orgy in there, and then if you added a tremendous amount of oxygen to it and let it bubble and brew, then you would have compost tea. If you want to see compost tea when you leave, there's a gray machine over there that's bubbling away making compost tea. But that's actively aerated compost tea, and that's the subject of next week's seminar. It's great stuff to use, and what it is just a super concentration of the microbes that you get out of the compost. You need to use it quickly. Once you take it away from the oxygen, it has about a 2-hour shelf life. But compost tea is great stuff, but we'll save that for another time. Yes, ma'am?
If the citrus peelings help with the root knot nematodes, would orange oil help as well?
If you got root knot nematodes, keep a good organic mulch on the surface of the soil. Compost or something, you won't have any root knot nematodes. It's best to control them naturally rather than trying to, in effect, kill them with anything. In compost, there is a fungus which grows. We've already talked about the fungus make those long threads. Well, this particular fungus makes very thin threads, and if you look at them with an electron microscope, they look like little croquet wickets. And who knows how all this has evolved. But those trap nematodes, this fungus that feeds on bad nematodes, actually gives off, in effect, a scent that makes that little blind, bad nematode think, okay, here's a root I can go burrow into, or here's something I can eat. When that nematode starts through that little loop, it triggers something. That loop swells up instantly with water and literally grabs it and lassos it and holds it and digests it.
Well,
Life and death in the garden.
If I had them and I convert to an organic program, how soon would I see good results?
At least 10 or 15 minutes. It gets better and better over time. It'll take a season or two to wipe out your root knot nematodes.
And would chicken litter be a good additive to that, and the citrus peelings and the...
Chicken litter is one of the best things going. The fertilizer that we sell, my favorite fertilizer is the Medina product. Medina makes a product they call Growing Green. When we find a product we really love here at the nursery, we go to the people that make it and say, how do you make it better? We like their Has to Grow, so we went to him and said, how do you make it better? And Stuart says, well, if I was going to do it over, I'd add more humates, some more seaweed. We said, fine, do it, put it under our name. We call it Natural Solutions Liquid. The Meister Grow people that make the Rose Glow, best blooming fertilizer I've ever found. We went to them and said, how would you make it better? I don't know what Gary said he would add, but he started adding several different things, and we call it Color Essentials. We love that Growing Green from Medina, so he said to Stuart, how would you make it better? I'm not sure what he's putting in it that makes it better, but we have the same product we call Landscape Essentials. It's just enhanced. But their base for their fertilizer is poultry litter. It's a poultry litter-based fertilizer. Now, yours I'm not concerned about, but you have to be real careful with poultry litter fertilizers because it's this factory farming that this country's into, and I'm not going to get on the soapbox that Bruce Dooley does, but if you could see the way that they raise chickens, they crowd them together even more tightly than you're crowded in here today and expect them to live and be happy, and to keep them from pecking each other to death, they feed them arsenic. It's a drug they call roxazone. It's full of arsenic, and that's what they use to keep the chickens calm enough to raise them up to where they can kill them and send them to the grocery store. You eat most grocery store chicken, you're getting your little dose of arsenic, which is not a good thing. Stuart, the poultry litter that he gets and uses for his fertilizer comes from, I believe it's Cargill, which is the one chicken company that does not use roxazone. So it's free. You may hear about, oh, it's not safe to use chicken litter because it's got arsenic in it. That may be true of some chicken litters, but it's not true of what you're producing at home, and it's not true of what goes into the Medina fertilizer. Okay, yes, sir.
Is there an easy way to get rid of cutworms?
Cutworms. Cutworms are easily killed with a natural bacterial product called BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. Spray a little bit of BT around periodically. Doesn't kill anything except caterpillars, which is basically what a cutworm is. You'll also find that if you're putting out beneficial nematodes occasionally, it'll usually get rid of the cutworms as well. If you have a real serious problem with them, save your soup cans and things like that. When you plant your tomato plant, plant it down through a soup can or something, because one thing about cutworms, they can't climb. And so you can put a little ring around, but I just spray with a little BT periodically, and I rarely ever have a problem with cutworms.
Bob, will the pickle treated hay hurt corn?
Yes, sir, I think it will. I'd have to go back and research that to be sure, but I'm pretty sure that picloram will hurt corn. Corn is a monocot, pretty closely related to grasses, so I'm not absolutely certain on that. I know it'll tear up alfalfa and everything you grow in your yard other than grass, but I'll have to research that for you and you'll see what I can find out. If somebody offers you a bunch of manure and you think, well, is this manure safe to use or does it have picloram in it, and the people won't tell you or else you don't trust them, take a bucket of water, dump some of that manure in and soak it for a day or two, and then go out and find a broadleaf weed, a dandelion, henbit, chickweed, something like that, a broadleaf weed, pour that manure water over it and go back 2 days later. If the weed shriveled up and died, you got too much picloram in that manure. If the weed's still growing like mad, you know that it's not picloram treated. That's how you check for it. Okay, let's move on to actually how I recommend. This is my method for growing different things, and some people here who grow very good plants will tell you that it works. And it's just, it's something to do if you plan ahead a little bit and if you have time. If you went into my garden right now, you would see, in fact, you would see a lot of this, but I try to go in ahead of the time that I'm going to plant and let the soil start getting ready. Like I said, the fertilizer is not immediately available, any fertilizer. It's going to be acted upon by soil microbes and things like that. And so wherever I'm going to plant an individual plant, be it a pepper plant, a tomato plant, or an eggplant, my way of planting it, I will go in and put 1 to 2 cups of the Medina fertilizer or whatever good fertilizer you have on the ground, and then I put the equivalent of 1/4 of a bag of that ladybug compost, which is like a little less than a 5-gallon bucket through. I'll dump that over the fertilizer, make a little depression in there, and for however long it is from then until the time that I'm ready to plant, every time I walk by I'll take the hose and I'll fill up that little cone with water. It soaks down through there. It's carrying all of this good organic material, the leachate, the humates, the different bacteria and things are going down into the soil. And then when I'm ready to plant, I simply go back and plant a plant right down through the middle of that, or 2 plants as I usually do my tomatoes. We'll talk about tomatoes in a minute. And I mean, literally, you want to back away so they don't hit you in the face as they come out of the ground. It almost seems like they grow that quickly. When I'm planting squash, I plant my squash in a pretty good sized hill. I'll put maybe 3 or 4 cups of fertilizer and the equivalent of a full bag of compost on it. Where I'm going to be planting things in rows, I'll put my row of fertilizer down and then I'll go down along the top of it with some of that compost and put it on top. It's just amazing what this does to get the soil ready for planting. Probably the thing that convinced me of what a good idea this was is that several years ago I was going to plant a bunch of fruit trees. And I mean, this was September. That ground was so hard you couldn't break it with a pickaxe or a digging bar. You know how hard soil gets here in late summer and fall. I knew I wasn't going to get my fruit trees till January, so I went out and everywhere I was planning to put a fruit tree, I put a wheelbarrow full of compost down there. Just mounded it up there, and then I didn't touch it. I didn't water it, didn't do anything. It was still a fairly dry fall. When I went back in January to plant my fruit trees, you could have dug that soil with a spoon. That's the result of all of that microbial activity getting in there and softening the soil. That's why if you've got really hard-packed soil, spraying with something like Medina Plus, which stimulates microbes, will soften it, help it absorb water. That's why spraying a little molasses works so well, while spraying some compost tea works so well. But, if you do this a little ahead of the time that you plant, your plants will just take off that much faster in the spring or in the fall or whenever you're planting. Is my entire garden that way? No. Part of my garden is still totally overgrown with weeds from last year when we had to quit gardening for lack of water and all. But there are plenty of spots where my first 20 or so tomato plants will go in. I mean, the cages are already in place. Everything's ready to go there. So today, you really want to plant tomato plants, but you know it's going to freeze again. Go ahead and get your soil ready. I mean, getting a little bit of a head start on it, you'll be amazed at how much better things will grow when you put them in the ground. I don't believe in treating prophylactically for most insect problems, but if you're digging around and you find a bunch of grubs, go ahead and put some beneficial nematodes down. Beneficial nematodes are very, very effective at eliminating grubs. You know, they come on a little blue sponge like that. There are 1 million nematodes on that sponge minimum. We count them all when they come in to be sure they're there. But, you know, put that down. That will control fire ants. That will control grub worms. That will control wire worms. Wire worms, these things, again, they're not worms. They're actually a little segmented. They're the larval state of a click beetle. But they look like a little golden segmented worm. You think, oh, no problem with those. Well, when you grow potatoes or carrots or things like that, they love to chew holes in things below the ground. The nematodes will control wire worms just like they will the grubs and most other problems that are in the soil. Yes? They do a very good job on fleas. I grew up, again, with my grandfather spraying malathion when we had a flea outbreak. If we got 90% of the fleas, we thought we were doing good. Several years ago, I had a horrible flea outbreak at my ranch. And I sprayed the beneficial nematodes. I could not find a flea a week later. Not one flea, and it was 3.5 years before I had to treat again. They really do work against fleas. Yes?
What about the little black ants on okra?
Those are usually fire ants. And, oh, I know, but let them get on. You'll know what they are. Fire ant seed eggplant, fire ant seed okra. There is a non-toxic material. Do we have any of it out here? Yeah. This stuff, harmless to people and pets, but good fire ant killer. And the garden is one place that I recommend killing most all of your fire ants. I do not recommend, especially if you have pets, don't kill all of the fire ants in your yard or on your property. Fire ants do a couple of good things, believe it or not. They kill termites, they kill ticks. And since we have such an infestation of fire ants, we don't have a fraction of the ticks that we once did. And ticks, I mean, the percentage of ticks these days carrying Lyme disease and other things is really high. And it's not just out in the country. A friend of ours lives about 6 blocks from here, got Lyme from a tick bite in her yard right here just off Jones Fallsburger. So I don't like ticks. And that's one good thing. I don't like fire ants either. But I always leave a few fire ant mounds around because they really, really have reduced our tick populations.
Okay, so you do the essential, then you do the compost, and then?
We're going to come to that next. Yes, ma'am.
31st row of collard greens, and about 1/4 of those plants were just totally covered in red and little aphids, like rust. So what would you do when they're that?
Aphids are, they can be a problem. Generally speaking, they don't show up until the end of the growing season. Lots of times if you get aphids, it's time to pull the plants up and plant something else. Collards, you should still have plenty of time. I would work at killing the aphids, different things you can use. One thing is just a blast of water. The aphids are sitting there and they've got their jaws in the plant, sucking the juice out of the plant. Hit them with a blast of water, the aphid body goes this way, the jaws stay in the plant. So you can eliminate them. If you wash them off the plants, chances are you've killed them in the process.
Plants are so big.
Yeah.
I can't get their relief.
Something like insecticidal soap is one of the safest things to use. Won't bother you at all, but it does a fair job at killing aphids. You can release ladybugs. Ladybugs do a wonderful job of controlling the majority of the aphids. And next time you plant, take a little fireplace ash and work it into the soil where you're planting. I have no idea why. But Malcolm did a bunch of experiments, and everywhere that he puts a little bit of ash in, he had virtually no aphids. Don't ask me why, but I've seen the pictures, and it does seem to work.
I have a question then. Last year, I had zinnias, a 30-foot row of zinnias, which bloomed from May through November. And gobs of butterflies that came. Would that promote the worms in the rest of the vegetables? I mean, this is part of a vegetable garden. Is that
That's a good question. All butterflies and moths have a caterpillar as a part of their life cycle. The caterpillars that make the butterflies, for the most part, don't eat stuff in the vegetable garden. The caterpillars that make moths, yeah, most of the caterpillars that you see chewing on things in the vegetable garden make a moth rather than a butterfly. Now there are are plenty of things that will eat in your landscape. The little pretty orange butterflies called Gulf fritillary, their larvae are going to be on your passion vines. The things that you see on your parsley and your rue, they make the black swallowtails. But in the vegetable garden, no. And the control for caterpillars, the BT is probably the best thing out there. Plus, of course, don't knock down your wasp nest. I realize we don't have any paper wasp nests, but those are the natural enemies of caterpillars. And people that have caterpillars probably knock down all their wasp nests. I mean, I have pecan trees this big around, probably 30 of them in one field, not all that big. But I never see a webworm. People in town, if you got a pecan tree, you got webworms everywhere. But I've got world-class wasp nests. Malcolm Beck was up at my place one time, and he walked around, and between my balcony upstairs and my porch downstairs, he counted 130 wasp nests. And I don't have any caterpillars. He loves the wasps. He said that first time, and if you want to see this, you take a stick, go break open a web where you have the webworms, and watch for a few minutes. You'll see the wasps coming in and hauling off the caterpillars. He said the first time he broke a web open, it took the wasp 10 minutes to find it. Said the second time he broke a web open, it took him 5 minutes to find it. Said the third time he picked up the stick and the wasp started following him. I don't think I'll go quite that far. But if you leave your wasp nest alone, you're not going to have nearly as many problems with caterpillars. Okay, yes, sir.
Wasp nest and yellow jack is the same thing, or they different?
The ones that make the paper things up onto the eaves, yes, those are what we call yellow jackets.
Like
You
that
go
one right there?
Yeah, like that one right up there. Don't drop, there are no wasps on it now.
Those are wasps.
Yeah, those, you go to the northern part of the country, they've got a nasty little hornet that lives in the ground, they call it a yellow jacket. But those guys are actually very good. But we won't go into all of that. I want to move on just a second to crops. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, just going back to the soil preparation. What kind of fertilizer, the 1 to 2 cups, what kind of fertilizer do you put in there?
I use the Medina fertilizer.
The growing green?
Yeah, or actually their form of the growing green. We have an enhanced form of growing green. We call it Landscape Essentials. Basically, it's the same thing as growing green, but I think he's putting a little extra green sand in there, and I don't know what else, but just that stuff. You get it here, that's what you get. Same price as a growing green, but if you have it elsewhere, growing green is what I would buy.
And you put that on the yard also.
Mm-hmm. Right. On the yard, on the ground covers, just about everywhere. I use it for just about everything. Okay, one more question.
So would you use both? I mean, you said the ladybug and the growing green, and would you use them both, or?
Whatever, the ladybug is the compost.
Okay.
The growing green is the fertilizer. So yes, very definitely use both. Okay, specific, yes sir.
Like if you use lava sand, how do you have to renew it, or do you have to renew it?
Lava sand brings some additional qualities to the soil. Well, lava sand helps with keeping more moisture in the soil and provides something we call paramagnetism, which I won't go into that discussion, but helps things grow a little bit better. If you apply lava sand, you ought to be putting it on once at least every 500 years. It does last for a little while. Okay, what's everybody's favorite vegetable? Tomatoes? We're talking about tomatoes? Okay. A few secrets to growing tomatoes. Number one, when you plant them, tomatoes are one plant that you can plant deeper than the plant is already growing. You know, we talk about most plants, if you pile soil up around the trunk, it's going to rot and cause problems. When you bury tomato plants deeper, they grow roots all the way up and down the stem. So if you've got big old tall lanky plants, bury them way down in the ground. If you can't dig a hole that deep. Years ago when I worked with Alton, we had some commercial growers that came in, and they always wanted to buy our overgrown tomato plants. I said, how on earth are you going to plant them? Well, I had two different people tell me two different things. One guy said, oh, I let them get so dry they go limp, and I just coil them up in the hole and fill the soil in over. The other guy said, I dig a trench, lay them down sideways, and just turn the top up and fill it in. But tomatoes you can plant deep, and if you want the best plants, you will plant them deep. Tomato plants are susceptible to a problem which is called blossom end rot. I'm sure most of y'all have seen it on your neighbor's gardens. It is like where the bottom of the tomato it starts out turning kind of watery, and then it eventually turns black and shrivels up a little bit. It looks ugly. You can cut the bottom off and still eat the tomato if you like. You think, oh, I'd never do that. Go eat tomato soup. You know what happens to all the bad tomatoes that don't make it to the shelf? They get turned into tomato soup. But anyway, blossom end rot is not a disease. Blossom end rot is due to an imbalance of two materials, one calcium and the other magnesium in the soil. we balance the soil, at least I do when I plant tomatoes, with Epsom salts. Just go to the drugstore, the grocery store, wherever, and get common old Epsom salts. And when you plant tomatoes, add a little bit of Epsom salts. Now don't put it in the hole, because this is not something that is taken up by the plant. This is something you're actually using to change the chemical composition of the soil. In this case, take it and just sprinkle it around. I cover an area about this big. About this big for those of y'all that were looking down. And I'll just grab a handful of it. I mean, I'm very, very scientific. I measure everything exactly right. Now, I grab a handful of it and go down where I'm going to plant each individual tomato plant. And I don't ever have blossom end rot. It's as simple as that. If you have a neighbor that comes to you later and says, I've got blossom end rot, what do? Well, you take those same Epsom salts and dissolve some in a bucket of water, about 2 tablespoons to a gallon of water. Go water the plants with that. It won't cure the tomatoes that are already going bad, but the new tomatoes that come out afterwards will pretty much be free of the problem. Second thing we do when we plant tomatoes, when you dig that hole, in the bottom of the hole, put a handful of phosphate, either rock phosphate or what we call colloidal clay phosphate. And you don't want to mix it through the soil. Again, I'll tell you Malcolm Beck's story. He had heard about this, and he did this. He put a handful of phosphate in the bottom of the hole. Malcolm has a lot more time than I do, and so he weighed. He had one row where he used this and one row where he didn't. He weighed the tomatoes that came off of each plant, that came off of each row. The row where he used the rock phosphate, he got twice as many pounds of tomatoes as he did off the row where he didn't. So he got dollar signs in his eyes, ordered about 4 tons of rock phosphate, and plowed it into his whole field there. You know how much his tomato production increased? 0. Because when you mix the phosphate with the soil, it gets tied up in our alkaline soils. It gets tied up in a form that plants can't absorb and use. This is why you put it in a big clump. We put a handful of it in the bottom of the hole, then plant on top of it. The roots go down through it. Doesn't have a chance to get, tied up in the soil. So put a handful of it in the bottom of the hole, and then plant your tomato plant directly on top of it.
Yes. And that's something you get at a nursery?
Any good nursery.
Okay. Like here.
That's the code word for shades of green.
Yes.
But anyway, I would say any good nursery. Let me tell you one more thing first. If you want to join me in experimenting this year, not the right stuff.
No.
Well, somewhere we've got a bag of it. Nature's Guide has come out with a new product. I'm going to make a tiny little hole in this and look and see if this is what I think it is, or if it is truly just the rock phosphate. They have come out with a rock phosphate. By the way, don't use superphosphate. Use the rock phosphate. It's much, much better product. And what does this look like?
That's really the secret.
Yeah. This is their a new rock phosphate that they have taken and coated with molasses. Now, I have a question, is that going to be too much molasses for the roots of the plants? I don't know. But when I plant in my garden, I'll have 2 rows of tomatoes, and on this side I'll have the same variety as I do on this side, but I'll be experimenting with something. I'll put something on one and not on the other. I'm going to be experimenting with a bunch of this molasses-coated rock phosphate, so if you want to try the same, I don't know. It sounds like a good idea, but whether it's going to be a good thing or not, we'll see. Yes, sir?
As an alternative, you take some of that molasses, dry molasses, and mix it with the phosphate, or will that?
I wouldn't hurt anything if you just use a little bit of it. But so far as I can tell, their molasses-coated rock phosphate is going to be as cheap as a regular rock phosphate.
Now you have both separate right now, and you don't want to go out and buy a...
Yeah, just mix them up, sure. Yeah, or just use don't even mix them up. Use your rock phosphate, just use a lot of the dry molasses around. Okay, other things about tomatoes. Plant lots of different kinds. I can tell you some very good tomato varieties, but the variety that was outstanding last year may not produce as well this year. The variety that was so-so last year might or might not be a really good variety for this year. So I always plant lots of different varieties of tomatoes. And tomatoes are generally classified to their growth habit as to whether they're called determinate, indeterminate, or semi-determinate. And basically, I guess you need to know what those terms mean. Indeterminate means that it grows like a vine. And it just keeps on growing on and on and on and on. Somebody told me they were driving over the big island of Hawaii, and they saw this tomato plant growing by the side of the road, sprawling along the ground. He said it was the same tomato plant, and he measured 2 miles down the road that this one plant was growing. So it grows as long as you will let it grow. That is an indeterminate tomato, and it obviously can put on a lot of fruit if conditions are right. Determinate tomatoes grow to a certain size and stop growing. And once you get one good crop off a determinate tomato, you might as well pull it up and discard it. Why would you ever want that, you say? Well, you know, the people that grow tomatoes don't pick them by hand anymore. They're picked by a machine. They grow them up to a certain size, the machine goes through the field and rips the plant up and takes the tomatoes off of it, and that's it. Then they plant more plants. So they want a plant that produces all of its fruit at one time. I don't. I want a tomato that continues to produce over a longer period of time. A semi-determinate, as the name might imply, you know, is going to fall somewhere in the middle. It will continue to grow, but not quite like a vine would. Now, one difference in large fruited tomatoes and small fruited tomatoes. Your larger fruited tomatoes are sensitive more so to nighttime temperatures as far as setting fruit. They won't set fruit if it's too cold. They won't set fruit if it's too hot. That's why your bigger fruited tomatoes, there's that window of time in the spring when it's the Goldilocks effect. Everything is just right that your tomatoes will set lots and lots of fruit. But your bigger fruited varieties, especially if you're listening to Jerry Parsons, your 444, so many of the ones he promotes, these are determinate big fruited tomatoes. And once they make that first set of fruit, that's all you're getting until the nights cool down in the fall. So I always plant a combination of large fruits and small fruits because the cherry tomatoes aren't nearly as picky about nighttime temperatures. And they will typically produce all through the summer months without regard to how warm the nights get or how cool the nights are once it's up to a certain temperature. So I believe in planting a big mixture of both cherries and the bigger tomatoes. Again, I will plant several varieties for a number of reasons. It seems like, you know, some years one variety just produces extremely well. Select for taste, and I guess that's one thing I should have said at the beginning. Keep records. It is so important to remember what you've done. I couldn't even remember when I was younger. I couldn't remember well, so imagine what I am these days. But what is it? Einstein said the only thing you have to remember are the things you can't look up. Write it down so you can go back and look it up. In my vegetable garden, up on one end, I've got an old rural mailbox. You know the old metal mailboxes you see up by the side of the road? It costs $10-12 at a hardware store. Stuck that on a post. It's perfectly dry inside. If you look inside my rural mailbox, among other things, you'd find my pruning shears, you'd find, you know, gloves, you'd find empty bags to put produce in, and you find a little journal where I can make notes. Don't even try to say, oh, I'll remember when I get back up to the house. You'll forget to do it. But keep a journal and write down what varieties you plant, write down when you plant them. If you use something special in fertilizer or something else you did special, make a note, because nothing is more frustrating at the end of the summer than thinking, man, that's the best tomato I ever grew. I wonder what it was. You know, keep notes and it'll make a difference. Yes, ma'am.
What about those purple tomatoes? Do they grow? Do they like the weather here?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there are a number. Cherokee Purple is a real good variety for this area. The other thing is it'll help you keep up with taste, because not all tomatoes taste the same, but sadly some of the best tasting tomatoes don't produce real heavily. Brandywine is described as the tomato that every tomato wishes it tasted like. But on my Brandywine plants, I get 1 tomato for every 10 tomatoes I get off my celebrities. So plant a bunch of different varieties, and you know, you'll have many more tomatoes. Thanks for coming to see us, guys. Yes.
If Color Essentials encourages blooming, could you put that in the whole to encourage blooming of the tomatoes, or is that just?
Why don't you try it and let me know.
It wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, it wouldn't hurt. And that's what experiments I intend to do. Our Color Essentials fertilizer, when we planted our pansies out underneath the sign out there, we mixed that half and half with the Medina fertilizer.
Okay. Is that what I should do?
Give it a try.
Okay.
And we'll see how it works. Yeah, we're going to call it our miracle mix. I mean, you can't even see the leaves for all the flowers on those plants. Okay, the other thing about growing tomatoes well. Grow them in a cage. Again, people who have more time than I do. Now this is one cage with an extension put on the top of it. Years ago, back in my college days when I was growing tomatoes even then, I made my cages out of fence wire. I could not afford to buy anything back then like this. And people, because I'd use 6-foot wire. And people would always say, why did you make it so tall? And I'd say, because the tomato's going to come right out of the top of it. And they'd say, no way. And I'd say, want to bet? The bet was usually a bottle of wine, and I never lost. But anyway, people who have actually measured the amount of tomatoes that they get off of a plant get twice as much production off of tomatoes grown in a cage as tomatoes grown in the ground. Now again, when I put this in, I'm going to push that down a foot into the ground, so it's not going to be quite that high. But my indeterminate tomatoes especially will be out of the top of that. My Juliets, last summer was a bad year. We couldn't water in Kendall County, so let's don't talk about anything last year. The year before, my Juliets came out of the top, circled over the side, and were back down to the ground again by the end of the summer. And I got tired of picking.
My
Anyway.
determinants get that tall.
Yeah.
Should have called me, I hope.
Maybe not. But anyway, I love tall cages. Now, this is a wonderful cage by a company called the Texas Tomato Cage Company. They are expensive. I bought, what did I buy, 4 a year? I think I bought 4 a year for about 10 years. And now I've got a whole lot of these cages. But the nice thing about them is at the end of the season, you can kind of fold them up and hang them on the fence and get them out of the way that way. But anyway, I think these things are wonderful. This soil is too hard. I wish I could push this down in just a little bit. But it really will help as far as the amount of production. Now, if you're like me, I'm going to show you just a couple of other things, and we'll move on to other crops. But, oh, and I should mention, you know, if you do this right, you're going to produce more produce than you can eat. You'll find you make a lot of friends with fresh produce. There's a restaurant that sadly is no longer in Bernie. I found I could walk in with a bag of fresh produce and have anything on the menu, no charge. It's amazing what you can do with good produce. But something we're going to do this year for the first time, a good friend with the Texas Department of Agriculture, Marilyn Magaro, I talked to the other day. And she has a lady she's recommended to us, and I'm sorry I can't remember her name, but who is a specialist on pickling, freezing, and canning. And later in the spring, we'll have a seminar on preserving your harvest. And you can come over and she'll teach you what you can freeze, what you should pickle, what you should can, and teach you a little bit more about that. Now, when I plant my tomatoes, I almost always plant them too early. I always think I've waited late enough, and then there's going to be a freeze forecast. And if you've ever noticed when you put those little plants in the ground, lots of times it gets real windy, and boy, they look tired after that wind hits them. I have gotten to where that when I plant my tomatoes, the first thing I do after I plant them is I will take and wrap. This is insulate fabric. This is what we recommend that you use for frost protection. But I will cut it in strips like this. And one of the first things I do is I'll go down from the ground. And again, if this will press down, it'll be up to about that point. Pass that around to me over on this side.
I use 3-pound coffee cans.
Well,
Get some of those.
yeah, mine are bigger than that.
But you're not selling those.
Anyway, that's what I do when I put my tomatoes actually in the garden. And that keeps the cold wind off of them. It helps keep insects away from them. And I don't know, I just find that it really, really helps to get them started. And then when somebody says, it's going to freeze tonight, I'll take a second little piece, thank you, and I'll come and it'll be a little bit bigger than this, but I will then put that over the top, kind of as a little hat, and I've had them go down to 25 degrees without any problem when I've done that with them. Even if you're smart and don't plant them too early, heard from a professional meteorologist the other day. Anyway, this guy's a real weatherman, not the clowns on TV that can give the wrong forecast and never have to apologize, but this is a guy that people actually pay him for accurate forecasts. And he was giving a report to the water district that I worked with up in our area, and he said that I think his exact words was that the El Nino is weakening, but it is still strong enough to have a significant impact on our weather this spring. He said the next 3 months, look for below average temperatures, above average rainfall, and the potential for violent weather. He said in this pattern, or in this part of an El Nino pattern, fronts tend to stall out right on top of us, and he said, he didn't say it's going to happen. He said, but we have a higher than usual probability of floods, hail, and bad winds and things like that. I will leave that on here, and I'll put it on there usually even if it's not going to freeze. And as we go through the growing season, I will put it higher and higher up on this because that gives me a lot of protection from hail. And I don't know how many of y'all have been through a hailstorm with a vegetable garden. The tomatoes were this tall. 10 minutes later, there's nothing but mush on the ground. So I like using little pieces of the insulate, to protect them from severe weather. The other thing about, hey, that's perfect. Other thing about the insulate is that it lets plenty of light through. You can leave it, covering your plants in the winter. You can leave it on here all season long, and the plants are still going to grow well inside of it. Now, one disease I almost hate to mention because it's not common, but I do see in this area every now and then, there are some virus diseases that tomatoes get. Most common one is called spotted wilt virus, commonly called curly top. And the tomatoes are growing along, and then all of a sudden they just make this horrible, bizarre, abnormal growth, and they stop making any new tomatoes. The part that's down below will ripen. This is due to a virus that the tomatoes, and viruses, you can't do anything about them. Once they're there, they're there. And this virus is spread by an insect called the thrips insect. It occurs on grasses, but if it picks up the disease, every future plant that it bites to suck the juice from, it will transfer the virus into the disease, sort of the AIDS of the plant world, if you will. And if you have had a problem with the spotted wilt virus or any other virus, take a bigger piece of insulate and go ahead and wrap that cage like 5 or 6 feet up. For some reason, the thrips that spread it always seem to move in a fairly horizontal plane. They don't go over the top and come back down in on top of your plants. And that is the one way that you can almost always totally protect your plants from the spotted wilt virus. By the time the plant gets up and out of the top of it, you've still got a lot of tissue below that can grow tomatoes, even if the top of the plant starts showing the effect of the virus. But again, Malcolm talks about that all the time, but I just have never, knock on wood, found it necessary in my garden, and most people don't in theirs. But if you ever fight the tomato virus, don't stop growing tomatoes. Just start wrapping your cages with the insulate. Is there a question for you? Yes, ma'am.
How many tomato plants do you put in a cage like that?
I put 2. You can put just 1, but I always put 2. Just in case a cutworm gets one or whatever. And that tomato cage is big enough that I don't really think they crowd each other. I'm disappointed with a cage full of tomatoes like that if I don't pick at least 50 pounds of tomatoes out of that. That's the kind of results you'll have, isn't it? You weighed your tomatoes, didn't you?
Yeah, one picking and 1 tomato and 1. Are you going to talk about cornmeal?
Yeah.
Now, is that the cornmeal you get in the store or not?
Doesn't matter. We'll talk about just a couple of other problems you could have with tomatoes. But you get a lot of pounds on a good tomato plant. Yes, ma'am.
You said you put 2 tomatoes in 1 cage, but when I generally put 1 in, but it's so completely compacted with 1. How in the world did 2?
It's more compacted with
Yeah.
2.
But they survive.
They survive. They survive. They don't seem to have any detrimental effects. Okay, one other thing. Tomato plants, one more common disease that you may see on them is something called early blight. And that's where they kind of start wilting, or don't wilt, but they turn yellow from the bottom and it just seems to spread up. A problem that occurs in the soil, and it seems to hit some varieties more than others. Cornmeal, whole ground cornmeal, is a wonderful material, and all that is ground up corn. And you say, what else is cornmeal? Well, the cornmeal you buy at the grocery store, the quote, enriched cornmeal, they have taken and polished the outer edges off of the corn. They've basically taken all the nutrient away and left you with nothing but the starch inside. They've taken away 14 essential nutrients, they put 10 of them back, and they called it enriched. I think that's what George Bush called fuzzy math. I still come out corn nutrients short. Anyway, what you want is whole ground cornmeal, and it has a very special property in that there is a beneficial fungus. We were talking about beneficial fungi earlier. There's a beneficial fungus called trichoderma, which grows on the cornmeal. And trichoderma wipes out a lot of damaging fungi. I mean, if you've got athlete's foot or toenail fungus, put it in your socks. You'll never have athlete's foot again. You can moisten it, soak your feet in it, you won't have toenail fungus. That's a whole other story. But we use it to control fungus problems on plants. And usually when I'm planting tomatoes, I'll just throw a handful of whole ground cornmeal on the ground around them. If I see any sign of early blight, or even if we don't, I'll usually spray. This is a natural material called plant wash. It really seems to do a good job of stopping early blight before it starts. The other thing you can do that helps, if you don't want to buy that, you can take your whole ground cornmeal, soak it in water for 24 hours, and then use that spray. Spray the foliage. You'll be amazed at how many disease problems that will prevent. Now I'm talking about tomatoes here, but that's also the same way you stop powdery mildew on beans and on squash and things like that, or just about any kind of fungus disease. You can stop with cornmeal or cornmeal tea or the plant wash. Yes.
And you do the Epsom salts at the same time you do the cornmeal.
I do the Epsom salts whenever I get around to it. I make sure it's down when I plant. But sometimes, some years, I'll put it down when I make my mounds of fertilizer and compost.
I just want to do everything one time.
Well, just put it down when you do your fertilizer and compost. Yes, sir.
The cornmeal, is that only beneficial on the surface of the soil, or?
It's most beneficial on the surface. It will help even worked into the soil. Friend Don Pylant, when Don was down at the San Antonio Botanical Gardens, he had an area that he just couldn't grow petunias because they rotted every year. He worked cornmeal into the soil and he never had rot again.
Okay, but the most benefit is on the surface.
I think the greatest advantage is on the surface. No problem at all. I know that people are busy and you have places sometimes you got kids waiting for you or whatever. You're not going to bother me if you have to get up late. What I'm going to do is talk about a bunch of different crops, and then I will stay and answer questions as long as anybody likes. But again, if you got to go, you got to go. That's most everything about tomatoes. Any other questions about tomatoes before we move on to another crop? Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about growing tomatoes in containers?
It's exactly the same way you grow them in the ground. You need to use big containers, grow in whiskey barrel size. If you want to do a novelty, you can do these, what do they call them, topsy-turvy pots where you hang them upside down and you get 2 tomatoes off of each one. Those tomatoes are going to cost you $20 a piece. Yeah, your neighbor does that. If you are super limited on space, there are truly miniature tomato plants out there. There's one called Red Robin, there's another one called Tiny Tim that only grows about this tall. They make fruit about as big as jelly beans. And if that's a tomato to you, that's fine, but I'm from Texas. I like it big.
Do you still recommend, Bob, putting a handful of fireplace ashes down in the hole along with the rock phosphate?
I'll put a little bit. Probably wouldn't put a full handful. I think that's more important on some crops other than tomatoes. Yeah, but it certainly won't hurt anything if you use a limited amount. High in potassium, and that makes things sweeter. Okay, what are we talking about? You want to talk about? Yes, sir.
I'd be happy to come to a seminar on how to pick tomatoes.
Help with my garden, right? That works. Yes.
Good tomatoes last year. Should we use the Epsom salt and the rock phosphate as a preventive?
Every year.
Okay.
Every year. I mean, Epsom salts are cheap. Rock phosphate, you've lost all benefit because it's dissolved and gone out in the soil. Rock phosphate helps with root growth and helps with fruit set.
Well, it jumps right up when you put that in the hole.
Yeah, it does. It does. They do grow quickly. But yeah, those are 2 things in the fertilizer I'd use every year. The compost you can use less and less every year as your soil gets better and better. Yes, ma'am.
I watched on TV when they planted the hole really, or the plant really deep, they take all the leaves off. No, you don't have to do that.
You don't have to do that. I just stick them down in the ground, pile the soil on. When you plant as many as I do, you do it quickly. Okay, what you want to talk about? Peppers? Everybody like peppers?
Yeah.
Okay, just 2 or 3 things about peppers. Not every pepper grows here. So don't think that you can get a seed catalog and pick any pepper you like out of it and it's going to grow here. Peppers are actually divided, I think, into 7 different categories. Some peppers are higher altitude, cooler weather plants. New Mexico chilies are going to do lousy here. But there are lots of peppers that we grow well. Most of the more flavorful peppers, translated hotter peppers, grow extremely well here. Many of your bigger fruited tomatoes will grow well in spring and fall, and we're always looking for varieties that really continue to grow through the summer. You can grow your beautiful red bells and yellow bells and orange bells, but you're not going to be as big as you see in the grocery store that came from California perfect weather, but you'll get especially nice ones spring and fall. Tomatoes are warmer weather plants though. Don't put them out when you when you plant your peppers are warmer weather plants. Don't put them out when you plant your tomatoes. Wait 2, 3, 4 weeks after you plant your tomatoes. Tomatoes will take temperatures, 35 degrees isn't a real problem to a tomato plant. It is to a pepper plant. I would like the night temperatures to be 50 or above when I plant peppers. Peppers, I find you get more production if you stake them up a little bit. My jalapenos especially will get so heavy the plants sometimes break, or we get a wind, they fall over in the wind. I'll tell you what I frequently use for growing. No, I'm not going to do that. For growing peppers and eggplants, I'll take this little extension that was on the top of this tomato cage, and I'll use that for support for my peppers and my eggplant. It works really well. I have in the past have also just put a stake in and tied them up. By the way, if you're going to tie anything up, there's a new material that's a Velcro material. You just cut it and push it together. There's none of this trying to tie bows and break up your plant at the same time. But peppers will grow better if they are staked. Peppers, like tomatoes, are susceptible to these big old tomato hornworms or tobacco hornworms. Either one can eat up a great deal. BT, this is the solution for just about any kind of caterpillar problem. It's totally harmless to you, but it's a bacteria that kills all kinds of caterpillars. Okay, I was going to talk about this in a minute, but since people probably have to come and go, I do want to talk about spider mites. Spider mites may be a problem on tomatoes, may be a problem on peppers, they will be a problem on beans. Some plants are just more susceptible than others to spider mites. The way that you stop spider mites is by spraying with liquid seaweed. You spray your plants every couple of weeks with liquid seaweed, you will never see a spider mite. Even marigolds, even things that are really known for spider mites. Spray that liquid seaweed and they simply will not be a problem. We make a product, or we have made for us a product, where we actually mix a little bit of the seaweed and a little bit of the molasses together. The ideal ratio is 2 to 1. If you want to make your own, take a gallon of water, add 2 tablespoons of seaweed, 1 tablespoon of molasses, or you can get a pre-mix like this. But if you spray your plants periodically with this, you'll have fewer caterpillar problems. You will not have problems with spider mites, but you will also have fewer problems with caterpillars. And here's the reason why. This material that kills caterpillars is a bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis. That's why we call it BT. But all bacteria, we told you, are really stimulated by molasses. By the way, if you're going to use this, put a little bit of molasses in with it. A tablespoon in your sprayer or so when you mix it up, be about 20 times as effective. My experience has been that when I'm spraying the plants with the seaweed molasses, I seem to get enough naturally occurring BT. This has happened one year that I went out and I found 2 or 3 big hornworms and if you know what you're looking for, it's pretty easy to tell that they're dying of BT poisoning. It's very, very interesting what it does to the caterpillar. But I looked out there and here these big old caterpillars are all of a sudden dying of BT poisoning. But guess what? I hadn't sprayed any BT. But I have been spraying with molasses. And apparently there was just enough natural BT in the environment that the molasses stimulated enough that it took care of all the caterpillars. Other than that, you're not likely to have many problems with peppers. The hornworm is about the only thing I ever see on them. Most people that have problems plant them too early, but do stake them, do brace them up, because you will get a lot of pounds of peppers off every plant. Yes, ma'am.
How many plants will you put in a cage?
Oh, and that little thing I'll put 2, just like I do the tomatoes. I do the same thing with eggplant. We'll talk about eggplant in just a minute. Yes?
Bob, is there a shelf life on the seaweed and molasses mixture?
Yeah, probably 20 years. BT has a shelf life of about 30 years.
Can you use it on any plant then?
Oh
or
yeah,
vegetable?
yeah. Only place I don't use it a lot on is white flowers, because the molasses will leave a little bit of a brown stain. But let me tell you, it makes a big difference on everything you grow. Yes, sir.
Bob, I took a pepper plant I had in a container and put in my garage over the winter. It still looks pretty good. Can I continue to?
Absolutely. Where peppers grow natively, which is mainly Central and South America, they're perennials. They live for years. I've known people that had jalapenos that produced for 3 or 4 years if they kept them from freezing. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between regular molasses and blackstrap molasses?
The blackstrap has a little more sulfur in it, has a few more minerals in it. As far as its practical application, it's the same. Any molasses is good molasses. Yes, sir.
Will BT work on thrips?
No. BT works on caterpillars only. Beneficial nematode works on thrips, if they're still in the ground. If you've got thrips insect problems, now we're getting right toward the end of the time you can put out the nematodes to control the larval state. Once they're up and in the air, they're going to deal you some misery. Garlic is a good repellent. If you get thrips on your plants, spray your plants with one of the garlic sprays and you'll have fewer thrips problems. Thanks for coming. Okay, I might as well go ahead and mention eggplant. Basically everything I told you about peppers applies for eggplants. That's about all you need to know about them. The variety of eggplant that I like the best is Ichiban. It's a long Japanese dark purple eggplant. The reason is that it's never bitter. I don't think I've ever picked Japanese eggplant, young or somewhat overgrown, that didn't taste good. If you grow the big round black ones, one's called Black Beauty, and there's several different varieties, sometimes they're bitter, sometimes they're not. A lot has to do with how much moisture they have received. But eggplant are easy to grow, and if you wonder if they're any good to eat, go over to P.F. Chang's sometime and order their minced chicken and eggplant. That's got Ichiban eggplant in it. I tell you, it's one of the best dishes on the menu over there. Eggplant's wonderful and easy to grow. I grow it in the top of these cages. Again, 2 plants per cage. They're a hot weather plant, though. Don't plant them until you plant your peppers. And do watch for fire ants. Fire ants will eat eggplant, but you certainly can control them. And eggplant is just really easy to grow and really, really delicious. Beans, anybody interested in beans? Okay. Beans are a legume. Beans actually improve the soil when you plant them. And what happens, I was looking to see if I had a package of beans. I thought I'd do it here, but I won't worry about it. Beans and peas are plants that have the ability to form an association with a type of bacteria, thanks for coming guys, that actually this bacteria is capable of taking nitrogen out of the air and turning it into fertilizer. Azobacter, nitrobacter, there are a bunch of different types of bacteria that do this. This is why in the olden days, as we might say, of our ancestors and things, before the days of fertilizers and things, farmers would tend to plant beans one year and corn the next, and then beans and then corn. Corn is a big nutrient robber. It steals a lot out of the soil. Beans put a lot back into the soil. So by rotating these crops, their soil stayed relatively productive. Doesn't really matter with us because we're improving the soil. But if you want the best possible production from your beans and peas, you would like them to have this bacteria on their roots, form little nodules on their roots. And it makes them grow bigger, makes them produce more. The first year that you put beans or peas into a given area, inoculate the seed. What I do is take the seed and I will soak it for an hour or so in water just to plump it up. Then I'll simply put my hand over the top of the cup, pour the water off, the seed's nice and moist. I'll put a little bit of this material in there and shake it up. I mean, the seed just turns black. This stuff is almost as fine as graphite. But it really does make a difference in the way they produce. The good news too is that once you've used it in a given area, if you continue to plant beans and peas in that same area, you don't ever have to use it again. It stays in the soil right there. So this is something you really only worry about the first time you treat. I usually do it every time I plant beans or peas though, because I move things around in my garden just kind of at random for no particular reason. But if I grew beans last year over here, and I planted beans back into this area, I wouldn't treat the seed. But if I plant them over here next year, I will treat the seed. But the first year you plant beans, which include lima beans, green beans, black-eyed peas, or peas like the snow peas, the edible pod peas, I'll be picking those pretty soon. And I will watch some people over at Sun Harvest or Whole Foods paying $7 a pound. I'll just smile and go and pick them. The only problem I have in my garden with picking things like the snow peas is so few of them make them into the bag. I mean, just when you could just pick it off and eat it. Please don't tell my employees because they think I just am a lousy grower of snow peas because I never bring very many to share. Simple matter that I eat too many before I even get back into the kitchen with them.
What's the name of that product?
It's just called inoculant. This particular one is called garden inoculant. Sometimes you'll see it sold under the name of nitrogen, and it's spelled G-I-N instead of G-E-N. But it'll really make a difference in the production you get from beans and peas. One thing, then I'll answer the question. Now, there are 2 habits of growth on beans. Some are what we call bush beans, and some are what we call pole beans. Bush beans, from the time you plant the seed until you start picking, is a shorter period of time. Pole beans take a longer period of time to begin production. But the other thing about bush beans is they make a lot more beans in a hurry than pole beans do. But they play out. You plant a crop of bush beans, you're going to pick for them for 3, maybe 4 weeks at most, and that's it. You might as well pull them up and start over. So if you want to have a lot of beans in a hurry, plant bush beans. If you don't mind bending over to pick, plant bush beans. If you plant pole beans, it will take a longer period of time for them to start producing, but they will produce all summer long if you keep the spider mites off of them with the seaweed and molasses. And you can, you'll pick and pick and pick, and the nice thing about those, you're picking up at, eye level sometimes, so you don't spend quite as much time bent double in picking. But they both produce very well. And some varieties, Blue Lake for instance, one of our old-fashioned beans, it comes as a bush form and as a pole form. So you can buy bush Blue Lake or pole Blue Lake. Just don't get them mixed up, because you don't have to support the bush form, but you do have to support the pole form. Now, what if you don't have enough fence or whatever to grow pole beans? You take an extra tomato cage and plant 8 or 10 seeds at that, and just let them grow up the tomato cage. I grow a lot of vining plants, on extra tomato cages, just because I run out of room. I have trellises. I use those big old heavy wire, what they call cattle panels or bull wire, that really tough, hard stuff, comes 4 or 5 feet wide. Some of them have 4x4 openings, some of them have 6x6. I have those set up with 3 posts for a 20-foot length of it, and that's what I grow a lot of my, vining crops on. That's what I grow pole beans on for the most part, but you can also grow them on a tomato cage really well. Questions about beans? They get spider mites, spray them with seaweed. Yes, sir.
As far as the bacteria in the inoculate, it basically is in one place, and how far away will they move?
As far as the roots go.
As far as roots go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Can we grow soybeans here?
Yes, ma'am. I'm still experimenting to find the best variety. I've had moderate success with one from Renee's Seeds, or one of those that they call edamame soybeans. Edamame, which I love, can be almost any soybean. And they've been fair producers, but I'm going to plant 4 varieties of soybeans this year just to see which ones will produce the best.
So do you carry the seeds? 'Cause
Yeah.
I can't find them.
Yeah, we have them in the warm season. They probably are out in there now. If not, we'll have them out very shortly. I didn't take them all for me. Yes, ma'am?
The inoculant, does it have a shelf life?
A couple of years. Keep it in the refrigerator, and it's good for a couple of years.
And you can't just spread it over the ground?
Needs to be in association with the seed.
But you need to soak the seed, right?
You don't have to, but it sticks better if you do.
Well, can you just wet them and just do it?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, but where's the price? $8 or $10 a bag. I mean, this is enough to do thousands of seeds, but I wouldn't want to buy enough to scatter this all over the ground. So it's more effective just put it in direct contact with the seed. Question?
Do you have to worry about washing your vegetables before you eat them, or,
Do you have a dog?
Well, I have my garden cage dog. I'm new at this, but
Yeah.
you hear about
I don't.
salmonella, scare with spinach, and you have to worry about.
Most of that is just, it's the product of the crappy way that we produce our food these days. Hear about the E. coli problem with meat? A grass-fed cow cannot have the bad E. coli in it. It simply will not grow in the gut of a cow eating grass. Cows are supposed to eat grass. Well, what do? We feed them corn, we feed them grain. When you do that, you change the pH, the acidity level in the rumen, in their intestine. And when you do that, you get bad bacteria going. So if everybody ate grass-fed beef, we wouldn't have any of the bad E. coli. It's just a product of the crappy way we raise animals and things. I don't worry about it. I pick and eat directly out of my garden. I mean, I'll wash my hands if I've been out petting the cows or whatever else, which I don't do intentionally. But anyway, if my hands are dirty, I'll wash them before I start picking. But no, I don't worry about washing things out of the garden. Okay, cute. Oh, yes, sir.
Can I digress for just a moment? When we first started, you were talking about the establishing a garden. And we're about 30 miles north of here. There is
Me too.
There is no dirt. So
Me too.
how deep should you were talking about getting the soil from New Earth? How deep should it be? And then you're adding ladybug, how deep should that be?
I would want probably 10 inches of soil to grow in. The amount of ladybug, add as much as you can afford. An inch or two would be great. Most of us settle for half an inch or less. Now, I live outside of Bernie. Parts of my ranch have deep soil, parts that much soil. But yeah, you can create raised beds.
So we'll be starting from, I mean, there's grass growing everywhere. How do we just mow that down and put the new dirt on top of it?
Mow it off. If they're native grasses, that'll probably get rid of them. If it's Bermuda, it's going to be an ongoing problem, and it will come up through. What I would do is, you know, you're going to make, no garden's big enough. Everybody has a garden, wants to make it bigger next year. We'll plan on making it bigger next year. In the middle of the summer this year, pick out the place where you're going to increase your garden. Get some plastic and cover it over with plastic, weight the edges down, leave that there for 6 weeks. It will fry out every grass and every seed underneath it. And then you won't have to deal with that. You're going to deal with some weeds this year.
So what, that's June, July, August?
Yeah, the hotter it is, the brighter it is,
yeah.
the better the solarizing works.
My last question about the soaking the seeds. I heard him, Howard, talking about soaking in Garrett juice this morning.
He does that, I don't. But, you know, he's rather fond of products that have his name on them. That he gets a percentage of when they sell. I'll probably try it this year. I just use water sometimes with a little seaweed in it. It works extremely well.
There's a question here.
Yes, sir.
You talk about beans.
Uh-huh.
You let vine. What about cucumbers?
Cucumbers are my next topic. Is there somebody else over here who had a question?
I have a quick question.
You're welcome, guys.
Do you have a website, like, you know, if we don't catch any of this, other than coming to?
Well, you should have gotten the handout. We'll have a lot of information. We're about to have a brand new website within a couple of weeks. We do have a website, and the address will be the same. Shades of Green SA is in San Antonio, shadesofgreensa.com. But our new website's going to be about 20 times bigger and better, and we're probably about 2 weeks away from launching it.
Did y'all record last week?
No, nobody was here last week.
No, I was here.
I mean, Jason wasn't here last week, and our other gentleman with the video camera wasn't here.
Do y'all have a schedule on these?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Ask to be put on our email mailing list. We send a monthly newsletter. We prefer to do it email. That way you get it on time. Everybody knows why the post office raised the rates was to pay for storage. We hear about people that got their mail after the seminar was already held, so if we do it email, we know you're going to get it. Okay, let's talk about cucumbers. Cucumbers are easily grown. Cucumbers are a vine. Cucumbers need something to grow on. I've grown living cucumbers in tomato cages and probably have 20, 30, 40 cucumbers at a time on each cage. It's a great way to grow them. I also grow them on, you know, fencing, that same type of fencing I was telling you about. Important things to know about cucumbers are pick them at the right size. It's kind of like squash, which we're going to talk about next. The contest is not to see who can grow the biggest one, because by the time they get huge, lots of times they're tough, and different cucumbers should be picked at different sizes. There are many, many varieties of cucumbers. If you want the little gherkins, plant the varieties that make the little gherkins. If you want the Armenian cukes that are this long, this big around, and still very sliceable and good, plant Armenian cucumbers. But just know which variety you want. If you want to pickle them, then, you know, plant one of the varieties that makes that nice, fat, medium-sized cucumber that's just the right size for pickling. Choose the right variety. Plant them, I usually plant them probably 6 inches apart, and they produce just on and on through the summer months. We talked about the plant wash and the cornmeal tea for mildew. That's about the only problem that ever gets on the cucumbers is mildew. Keep it under control and they'll produce virtually all summer. Now, one thing about this group of plants, the cucurbits, the cucumbers, the squash, the pumpkins, the melons, the first several flowers that come out when they start making flowers are male flowers. All they make is pollen. When you look at that little flower, you'll see the bright yellow pollen in there. But it will never ever make a cucumber or a squash or a melon or whatever else. Those flowers are male only. And on a given vine, it may be the first 4, it may be the first 10 flowers that come out will be male flowers. And you're going to be thinking, I got all these flowers, but I got no cucumbers, no squash, no melons, whatever. It's a normal thing. The first batch of flowers do not produce any fruit. The next batch of flowers that come out further down the vine will be the female flowers. And if you look at right behind where the flower is, you'll see the little tiny squash or cucumber or melon or whatever else. You guys, thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
Bring pictures and let us see how your garden did.
Thank you so much.
Certainly. I should warn you, technique that I learned when I worked with Alton years ago, people would come in with fruit that they wanted to brag about. They would walk in with this huge, beautiful tomato, and I knew that all they were doing was bringing it to show it off. But I would always look at them and say, oh, you shouldn't have. And then they felt like they had to leave it with you. And I got a lot of good produce that way. Today I get enough without doing that. But anyway, you will get, believe me, you'll get plenty of cucumbers or squash or melons or whatever else. But be patient. The first flowers are not supposed to produce fruit. Now, in order to get good production from squash or cucumbers or anything else, these, unlike tomatoes and peppers are wind pollinated. You know, you don't need bugs to get fruit from these things. Just the wind blowing the pollen around pollinates the flowers. The cucurbits, you need something to pollinate the flowers, be it honeybees, mason bees, even some kinds of flies pollinate the flowers. And if you have a squash or a cucumber that starts to develop and it's nice and fat for this length, then all of a sudden it goes in this little skinny end down there, it didn't get well pollinated. The seeds that would have developed further on down the fruit didn't get pollinated, so they can't develop and grow. So don't do anything that discourages the bees from coming into your garden. If you feel like you have no bees, you can always plant plants that attract bees. The other thing you can do, I mean, what do bees eat? Bees don't eat high fructose corn syrup. Bees eat honey. And if you want to get more bees in your garden, take a shallow saucer, make a mixture of about 1 part honey to 4 or 5 parts of water. Float a sponge in this mixture so the bees don't drown. You'd be amazed how many bees you will draw into that. And that's one way. Again, we've got so many pesticides around. We've got so many problems with honeybees that a lot of people say there are just not nearly as many as there once were. Hear a lot about colony collapse disorder. It's rarely going to be a problem in your garden. And everybody talks about honeybees and how wonderful they are for pollination. The so-called cedar bees or mason bees. You look around here, you'll see some holes in some of these big old pieces of cedar that look like they've been plastered over with mud. This particular bee comes in and drills a hole in there and lays its eggs inside of there. The mason bees are said to be about 40 times as effective as honeybees at pollinating flowers. So any kind of bees you've got in the garden are going to be a help. But for squash, cucumbers, melons, all those things, you really need bees in there if you're going to get good production. Yes, ma'am.
I have a whole lot of bees on this, but I don't know what it is. I think I planted lettuce. I don't want it back.
Take note. Oh, that's broccoli.
Yeah, no, it's not broccoli. It is something in the lettuce group.
There's a leaf in this.
Yeah, it's could be arugula. Smells like arugula. But you just let it go too far.
Yeah, okay.
It's tasty.
Pretty flower.
Oh, it's pretty flower. And on broccoli, I always leave a few heads of broccoli, let them come out and make flowers, just because it brings so many bees into the garden. Before I go further, let me tell you about 2 things that you really ought to have if you get serious about this. If you're new to this is the best vegetable gardening book around. It was written by Howard Garrett and Malcolm Beck. There are a ton of vegetable books out there. Most of them are written for the northern part of the country and aren't worth a darn for this area. If you want a good book, this is the book you want for this area. The second book that I'll recommend that all gardeners should have on their shelf is called the Texas Bug Book. I don't think the guys put one of those out. But it's also by Howard Garrett and Malcolm Beck, subtitled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it is just a great book to tell you which are the good guys and which are the bad guys, and just a lot of little stories and things mixed in along with it. But those are 2 good things to ask for the next holiday: Easter, Mother's Day, Father's Day, whatever comes along, anniversaries, whatever.
Sunday.
Yeah, Sunday. That's good. That's a good reason. Okay, cucumbers and peppers and things. Okra. Okra is easy to grow, but okra takes a lot of room. So, and it is a real hot weather plant. Don't plant your okra until we really get into warm weather. Thanks for coming. There's red okra, there is green okra. again, like squash and cucumbers and things, it is not a contest to see who can grow the biggest okra pod or the biggest squash. And if you, I mean, literally, you will have to pick every day. And I guess I'm kind of combining squash and okra here. The squash that's this long today will be this long tomorrow. The okra that's this long today and really tasty will be this long and tough tomorrow. And even if you miss a day or two of picking, and you've got these overgrown fruits out there, pick them off and do something with them. I throw them over the fence and let the cows eat them. Thank you guys. But if you leave them on there for a longer period of time, I mean, what's the purpose of producing fruit? It's not to please us, just like flowers aren't to please us. It's all about making seed. And if the plant chemically senses, man, I've got a nice big okra, a nice big squash, whatever on there, I'm going to be able to make plenty of seed, it's going to stop producing any more. So you keep these things producing by picking them off. And if you accidentally, again, this is your neighbor's problem, not yours, I'm sure, but I guess in that case I'm your neighbor, because some days, if I get home late on Fridays and I leave at 3 o'clock on Saturday to come into town, I don't always get everything picked, and sometimes by Saturday night things have gotten overgrown. Pick them off and throw them over the fence. There'll be more there tomorrow. Questions about okra? Fire ants do like okra. You will want to control your fire plants if fire ants if you have okra. Other things, we're just right toward the end of the growing season, or the planting season, I should say, for some things. Broccoli, great time to be planting broccoli. I planted some Thursday. I'm picking broccoli off what I planted 3 months ago, but go ahead and plant some more. As we get later into the spring, those heads are going to develop very quickly. And the time between making a nice tight head of broccoli and having a bunch of yellow flowers is pretty short, a period of 2 or 3 days. So go out every day, and cut and harvest your broccoli. Broccoli will make a beautiful big head, and even after you harvest that, leave the plants alone, because they make more and more and more little side heads. Again, I'll tell you a personal story. I didn't grow it for years because I shared the garden with an elderly uncle who used to always tell me, don't bother planting broccoli, it won't grow here. His name was Heine, German for Henry, and I got to thinking, I think I could grow broccoli, I'm going to try. I grew broccoli that the heads were as big as this, and I went in and said, Heine, why did you tell me broccoli wouldn't grow here? And he said, because I don't like it. The funny thing was, once he tried my broccoli grown in our own garden, he found out he liked broccoli after all. But broccoli grows extremely well. Plant some in the fall. Planting in the fall is a gamble. And if you think that you're going to if you think everything you plant is going to do really well for you, you still believe in the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and other things. It's not going to happen. And it doesn't mean you're a failure if one or more of your crops doesn't do well. My fall planted broccoli is now producing very well for me. My cauliflower didn't do worth a damn this year. I pulled it up and thrown it away because I didn't get a decent head out of it. But you can plant more cauliflower right now if you wanted to. Years past, I've had heads of cauliflower, yay big. Let me tell you one thing about cauliflower too, even though it is getting a little bit late for it. If you grow cauliflower, it makes big old leaves. Before the little cauliflower heads start to form, take the 4 or 5 top leaves and pull them up over the top of the plant and put a rubber band or something around them. Cauliflower sunburns. And I mean, it only takes 1 day of bright sun. That beautiful white cauliflower will be brown and ugly looking. It still tastes good, but you're not going to want to eat it because it doesn't look like cauliflower is supposed to. Cauliflower is very, very sensitive to sunburn. Pull those leaves up and make an umbrella over the top of it. Now broccoli, as I told you, if you plant the right variety, you'll be harvesting those little side shoots for a long, long time. Cauliflower, once it's made its one big head, that's it. Once you cut the head out of it, you might as well pull it up and throw it in the compost pile. Always have an idea of how long it's going to take things to produce. And I'm going to back up to squash for just a minute. There are what we call summer squashes. Thank you for coming. They're what we call summer squashes and what we call winter squashes. Winter squash does not grow in the winter. Summer squash produces very, very quickly. Thank you guys. 40 to 50 days you'll start getting production from your summer squash. Winter squash takes 150 to 180 days to produce. We plant summer squash and winter squash at the same time in the spring. we start harvesting our summer squash, you know, a couple of months later. The winter squash, it's going to be the end of the summer or into the fall before it starts producing. Up north, where they have a shorter growing season, they would harvest the summer squash in the summer, and the winter squash wouldn't be ready till autumn. And that's, you know, winter squash are things like spaghetti squash, turban squash, Hubbard squash, butternut squash, spaghetti squash, what am I missing, acorn squash. Those are winter squashes. And the only difference in those and the summer squash is that it takes a lot longer for them to grow. Again, know how long it takes things to produce. Little plants of broccoli and Brussels sprouts look a lot alike. But with broccoli, you're going to be harvesting good heads of broccoli about 6 to 10 weeks later. Brussels sprouts, it's going to take 20 weeks or so. If we plant broccoli and Brussels sprouts at the same time in September, we'll be harvesting broccoli November and December. The Brussels sprouts won't be producing until the following March or April. So we never plant Brussels sprouts in the spring. They don't have time to produce before it gets hot. That's why I tell you it's important to know what the right season is to plant all these different things.
Onions?
Onions, what do you call these? You call these onion sets? If you do, you're wrong. These are onion plants. People sometimes refer to these as sets, but they are not. The sets are little bulbs that have been interrupted in growth, and I've never grown a decent crop of onions from sets in this area. But I do grow very good onions from these. And these things can be planted anytime from about November on. We're right toward the end of the planting season for onions. So if you're going to plant onions, do it within the next couple of weeks. But the way that I plant onions from these little plants, by the way, if you're going to plant them from seed, you have to do it in the fall. Don't try to grow them from seed in the spring. You can grow them from seed in the fall as well as from plants. That big old yellow onion, what they call the Texas Super Sweet, they call the 1015. Everybody know why it's called 1015? October 15th is the date you're supposed to plant the seeds. Ladies don't have much imagination. Anyway, the way that I plant these plants, and remember each plant is going to theoretically produce a good sized onion bulb on it. But I still go ahead and plant the plants close together. When I'm planting these things out, and I plant 500 or 600 onions every year, that's 5 or 6 bunches. But I'll plant them about 1 inch apart in the garden. And I'll go back 6 weeks later and I'll pull out every other plant. I don't know about you, but I love grilled onions. You know, a little thin. There's just so many good things you can do. So I'm pulling out every onion and having it to enjoy. About 6 weeks later, I'll go back and I'll pull out every other onion. They're wonderful little onions, about this big around. It's usually about the time my potatoes are ready, and that's the next thing I'm going to talk about. Man, boil up some new potatoes and little onions like that, it just doesn't get any better than that. But that means that by the time summer comes around, when they're going to make the big onions, they're about that far apart instead of 1 inch apart, but I've enjoyed 2 harvests in the meantime. So that's how I plant the onions. Now, some of the onions in your garden will decide that they want to make flowers.
Yeah.
They'll come up and they'll have the tall leaves, and then they'll have a head of flowers on top. And by the way, don't always look for the biggest plants. The biggest plants to me are the ones that most often tend to flower. The smaller plants rarely ever flower. Nothing wrong with the flowers, but an onion that has flowered will not keep.
That's right.
To taste it, you won't know the difference in the taste of that one and the one next to it that decided not to put on flowers. The ones that haven't flowered, keep them in a cool, dry place. They'll store for 6 months or longer. You let them make flowers, you better eat them because they'll keep for 4 to 6 weeks and then they're going to rot on you. So just keep an eye out. When you pull them, if it's got flowers on it, you know, eat it immediately. If it doesn't have flowers, you can save it for some period of time. Just 1 second. You can harvest them anytime. Typically the bulb will be at its maximum size in early summer when the top starts to die and fall over. That's the ideal time to harvest if you're going to store them. Other thing to keep in mind, keep the foliage on your onions as healthy as possible. You may see a little worm get on them periodically. If you let them get too dry, you may have some thrips problems on those. But, you know, when you slice an onion, you know, all those rings that are inside of there, every ring corresponds to 1 leaf. If you got 15, 20 healthy leaves on that onion, you're going to have 15, 20 rings in there and you're going to have great big onions. You got 2 or 3 little skinny leaves on that onion, you have a little bitty bulb with 2 or 3 rings. So keep the foliage on your onions as healthy as you possibly can.
I wanted to ask you about soil preparation when you put those in, or feeding them after you've put them in.
You know, I do the same thing as I do with the others. I'll put the fertilizer down, put some compost down a few weeks ahead of planting. But then, and I guess I should have said this really on everything, 6-8 weeks later, I'll either start feeding with a liquid fertilizer, or else I'll go back and throw some more
Has
dry
to grow
fertilizer
or
on.
whatever you got.
Yeah, the has to grow, or our natural solutions works real well.
Thank you.
Questions about onions? Okay.
But with garlic, kind of the similar thing?
Garlic, it's very critical when you plant garlic. And the way you plant garlic is you plant the little individual cloves. Do it in November. October and November are the 2 months of the year that you plant garlic. And there are probably 300 different kinds of garlic you can plant. It'll be ready when the tops fall over in June. And garlic is a great crop. How they can charge the prices for it in the grocery store they do, I don't know. But garlic is one of the easiest things you can possibly grow.
How much water?
Really, with everything in the garden, thanks for coming, guys. Water really thoroughly when the soil's dry and knuckle deep. If you follow that rule, you'll never have a problem. I can't tell you how often, because that's going to depend on, you know, how hot it is, how windy it is, how sunny it is. But you want your plants to have a thorough watering every time the soil's dry, about 1 inch or 2 deep.
Is Medina Plus, how often should you use that in the garden?
Medina Plus is a bacterial activator and enhancer. It's not a fertilizer. And if your soil's in really good shape, you don't ever need to use it. If you're getting a new garden started and you want the best results, use it about every 6 weeks. Thank you for coming, sir. Use it about every 6 weeks. It's cheap and it'll never hurt anything. Certainly. Okay, I'm sorry. We're going to talk about potatoes, and then I guess I'll just answer any questions that anybody has. But if you want to grow potatoes, potatoes are easy to grow, but it is time now to get them planted. Let's see, yeah, set this up here.
Y'all sell the potato seeds?
They're planted from actual potatoes. They're not planted from seeds. But we sell what are called seed potatoes. Nobody wants to have potatoes in their dish drainer that are starting to sprout. Used to be that before they sent the potatoes to the grocery store, they would subject them to very brief, very cold temperatures, and it would freeze and kill these little eyes before they could develop. That wasn't so bad, but nowadays they're actually chemically treating them to keep these little eyes from sprouting. Number one, I don't like the chemicals, and number two, I just don't like the way that they're doing it. So when you plant potatoes, you will normally plant what we call seed potatoes that we know have not been treated to keep the eyes from sprouting. This is kind of a little one. I usually plant slightly bigger potatoes, but when you plant them, you're going to cut them up in smaller pieces, and you're going to be sure that each piece has 1 or 2 eyes on it. I typically cut them in fourths. I'll usually plant 4 pieces from each potato. This one I might only cut in 2. A really big one I might cut in even more. That's the size potato. I'm usually going to whack it either 4 or 6 pieces. I'm just going to be sure that there are at least 2 eyes on each section. Sometimes you have to be a little creative as you whittle on them, but that works okay. Now, when you cut it, you're going to have exposed, fleshy, watery tissue there. It's good to kind of cauterize that. The 2 things that I use, I will either roll them in rock phosphate, powdered rock phosphate, or roll them in wood ashes. Either one of those things seem to work very well. Potatoes will grow as, tuberous growths out along the roots. They're going to sprout, they're going to come up, they're going to make a top. We usually end up planting them in February. Sometimes they freeze down. They can freeze down 2 or 3 times and still come back out again and again. But I try to plant them, I planted mine Thursday. I might have been a week later by some people's standards, but like the meteorologist said, it's going to be colder a little bit longer, so I'm going to be planting a little bit later this year than I would most years. But I'll plant them about 18 inches apart. I'll plant them about 1 inch deep. And they come up and they make a real bushy, pretty plant. After a few weeks, if you look carefully at the soil, or if you take your soil and kind of wash, or take your hose and wash a little bit of the soil away from the base of the plant, you'll actually see developing potatoes on there. They'll be nice and smooth skin. They may be the size, maybe up to the size of a golf ball after 6 or 8 weeks. And if you want to, and I do this, go out and go around each plant, take your finger and reach down and pop out 1 or 2 little potatoes off that plant. There's just nothing much better than new potatoes, and so many different ways to fix them. And that's what you're getting, are the young, tender potatoes. And you can go ahead and take 2-3 potatoes off of each plant without really hurting the plant or hurting your later production. If you wait until later in the season, of course, the potatoes will be much larger. But the trick about growing potatoes is you have to decide, do I want a potato that I can eat fresh like a new potato, or do I want a potato that I can store away with my onions and it's still going to be good, 2, 3, 4 months from now? If you harvest the potatoes with a green top on them, they're going to be thin skinned and they're not going to keep. They're going to be delicious, but they're not going to keep. If you want potatoes that are going to keep, you either go through and cut the top off, or else you wait for the top to die naturally, which it will do in early summer, and wait about 2 weeks before you dig them up. If they stay in the ground for about 2 weeks, after the top is gone, whether you cut it off or whether it died, they develop a tough skin. This is the way nature protects them. In nature, nobody digs them. They just sit there and sprout out the next year and the whole process starts over. But if you want potatoes that you can store, cut the tops off or let the tops die and wait 2 to 3 weeks before you dig them. Then they will have a tougher skin, and if you store them cool and dry, they will keep for a long, long time. Yes?
Would be the same way with sweet potatoes?
Sweet potatoes are a whole different story. Sweet potatoes, we plant those as what we call slips. You go to the store, sweet potatoes are not treated. You go to the store, you get that sweet potato. Some people will stick some toothpicks in it and set it down in a jar of water. We all did this as kids. The vines come out and grow everywhere. Some people will put it in a little bed of sand or something. But where those vines come out, you can take a very sharp knife and you cut a little section of tissue out of the potato along with the vine, and that is what is referred to as a slip. And then you go out and plant the slips in the garden. And each of those, you better plant them a substantial distance apart, because they get big. They grow like a weed. And the potatoes will develop on the roots of those, just as they do on the others. But unlike this kind of potato, the sweet potato will continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger as long as you leave it in the ground. And if you leave them in for a long, long period of time, you will have big sweet potatoes. Biggest sweet potato I think I've seen weighed 65 pounds.
So each slip just makes one?
No, each slip will make multiple potatoes. And they like loose soil. But in an area the size of the floor right here, gosh, I wouldn't plant more than maybe 6 slips in the whole area. And I would go back and start digging in the middle of the summer. And you'll find nice medium-sized sweet potatoes. If you let them go till late in the fall, the average one's probably going to weigh 6 or 8 pounds. But this kind of potato is going to be within 3 or 4 inches of the surface. Sweet potatoes may be as much as 6 to 10 inches down.
If you leave them for a long period of time, will it affect the flavor?
It affects your ability to bake them. Not everybody's oven's big enough. And they do get a little tougher. I won't say it really affects the flavor, but it certainly affects the texture.
So sweet potatoes plant 6 to 10 inches down?
No, plant the slips right on the top, but when you dig the potatoes, you're going to be digging deeper.
Okay.
And we don't plant sweet potatoes until the weather's hot. Sweet potatoes we plant in April and May.
Okay.
These potatoes we plant in February. Yes, sir.
Well, how much of that little eye has to be showing before you plant the potato, before you cut it?
None.
As long as you see it?
You can see it. When I planted, probably 2/3 of them, you couldn't even see the eye beginning to develop.
Because I got some and they're just...
Yeah, I like to do it before the eyes get very big, because they bust off too easily if you let them get
What
very big.
about, sorry, now, I tried to grow some potatoes in a container, and actually a trash can, I bought a new trash can, but I noticed I got a lot of gnats.
You're keeping them too wet. You're having gnats in the soil, you're watering too often. If you want to get rid of them, these same nematodes will take care of the gnat larvae, but if you're having fungus gnats, you're keeping the soil too wet and your potatoes are going to rot.
But how do you know, because I had always read, and even on the internet, like 1 to 2 inches, that, you let that completely dry out and then...
I go to the 2-inch end of it on potatoes.
Okay.
And remember, it's not how